Hey guys, this is sort of a informal check-in. We're in what, halfway through week 11 or something like that of the semester, so maybe two-thirds of the way through the semester. Um, in general, I just wanted to kind of check in about a couple of things. One that, so some of you had asked me about resources to kind of help with the scientific writing piece of the course. So I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about what makes what we're doing a little bit different and why it's hard to find resources. But I did find some, I guess, that may be useful that I'm going to point out in this particular video, but also I'm going to put up on Brightspace. So this came up, this video is available via an announcement on Brightspace. So in that announcement, you'll see links to these documents as well. So this is a conversation I've had with a couple people via email, actually, which is, so one of the reasons why it's challenging to find good written documentation to reinforce what we're doing in class is this particular framework of what we're doing and the way that we're approaching it in this class isn't like it's an existing, you know, everybody teaches writing this way kind of thing, right? So what usually happens when you're learning to write, and I may have told you this at some point, but if I did, sorry, but if I didn't, cool. What usually happens when you're learning to write like this is you're writing about content and you're also being held to a standard of form at the same time. So what I'm trying to say is many times you're learning the how and the what at the exact same time. And we are, as a couple of you pointed out, sort of skimming the surface of second language research. There is a lot, but this is a survey course in that sense, right? So we poke our fingers into a lot of little pots along the way to kind of get a sense of what are the issues that exist in the field of second language research. Um, and that's a good hallmark of I would say an undergraduate degree is you have a mixture of courses that do deep dives and courses that do broad approaches. So a lot of our like morphology and syntax for an undergrad course are deep dives, not for grad courses, but for undergrad courses they are. Whereas this sort of thing is pretty broad. Um, so usually the reason why I designed the scientific writing component in this way is that I watched a lot of people in graduate school come into trying to write about whatever it was they were studying, right? So imagine I was doing a study on like the role of output in second language acquisition and whether it helps me long term or whatever. And but they're trying to learn to do at the exact same time is study these particular papers. Maybe they're designing a study, so learning how to do study design. And on top of it, they're trying to write about it. Those are all very different skills, actually, right? So there's the part where we talk about what do we know about output? How do we look at the data? How do we analyze the data? And then there's the part where we talk about how do I run a study on this? How do I design a study on this? And then there's the part we talk about how do I write about this? And I see a lot of really talented scholars who haven't been asked to do this very much, who bang their head against the wall over and over again in the process of figuring out how to do it, which to me says that it is a skill in its own right. And some people it comes very naturally to them. To those people, kudos, right? But to most people, I don't think it does. I many times I've heard professors talk about other students, which means they talked about me when I wasn't there, but other students are like, oh, this person does not edit. They sent me a first draft. And I actually don't know if it was a first draft in some cases. I go, maybe what they think it should look like and what you think it should look like are very different things. And I honestly think that's the crux of the problem, expectations and knowing what stuff looks like. One of the biggest keys to knowing what stuff should look like is reading and reading and reading and reading. And for example, at the undergraduate level, you guys don't know quite enough about the material to read a ton of articles. You should read some articles. I think it's a good experience, and you'll have to in the 400 level courses. But, the number of articles you have to read to have an intuition about how an article looks and how writing of this style looks is a lot. actually, and so there's a gap between, when you are asked to start doing it and when you have enough experience to do it kind of by experience. Um, the actual process of learning to write in this way is a mentored process, Typically, as I have mentioned at some point, typically this class, Ling 317, excuse me, 317 usually has a small writing component. In that you guys would be asked to do multiple drafts of an outline about a problem where you compare and contrast two constructs. And then the third draft is where you write it up. And then the fourth draft is an optional fix it, right? And this sounds really like, psh, of course, but it's actually really hard. I'm telling you, as someone who teaches it year after year, some students extremely struggle with this, which is the reason why it goes through multiple drafts of outlining before you even to put pen to paper. And I know outlining as it's done in like, middle school, high school is vacuous and useless. But when you're talking about something where you're evaluating data and trying to compare findings and pull a thread out from it, it's actually kind of important. I think because it's a lot of information. When you're outlining in eighth grade about why you like jelly beans, I have a vague memory of someone writing a paper about that many years ago. You know very well what your three major points for your 5 paragraph essay is. You know what your points about jelly beans are. They're colorful, they're sweet. I don't know, maybe you like jelly bellies in particular because there's a variety of flavor. Whatever. You know them. But in research, it's a lot of people's ideas. It's a lot of different ideas. And on top of it, you're trying to evaluate evidence in a very fair manner. So it is a lot to ask someone to keep all of that in their working memory, talking about working memory, keep it in their working memory long enough to put it on paper cohesively. Some people, I think the people who can do it very early on are bootstrapping a heck ton of working memory, but it's not really feasible, to ask everyone to do that. So that's why I think about it in terms of an outline first, because you can work on the outline like a puzzle and then you can go back and write. Professional writers, academics and such do write multiple drafts, and I think we underestimate that as young writers. We have a tendency to go, I wrote it, it's done. Yes, oh, I'll tweak it. Whereas people who write for real, you know, there's this joke about a thesis. I don't know if it's a senior thesis or a doctoral thesis or a master's thesis. I have no idea. But the joke is kind of like where someone's like, all right, you know, master's thesis. Boop. He goes, oh, okay, master thesis final version. Master thesis final version 2. Master thesis final version. Master thesis final version. Because the person keeps thinking it's done, but writing is actually you write and you write and you write because you get feedback and usually there's very far to go. And I don't think we realize that is that when we write things for real, like for real, before you become extremely, extremely good, most people need to do 4 or 5 versions of a paper for it to be substantially good. And I want you to have that expectation. If you're writing something serious, something that matters, you should be thinking on that scale, you know. And writing one draft, you should be talking, the other thing we typically talk about in this course, that I'm trying to tell you this because it's useful for the rest of your life, I would say, especially if you're writing, I guess, if you never write again, whatever. But like dedicating enough time to it, I think, is something that we underestimate. So if I want you to write me so this particular assignment that normally gets done in this course, let's say that you are doing the second version of the outline. The first version is really bare bones. I have a section on output. I have a section on, I don't know, measurements of proficiency and then interactions or whatever. The basic outline is really easy. The second outline, you have to incorporate sources. And I try to tell students, I was like, you should be blocking out anywhere from 3 to 8 hours to work on this. Not because I think what I have assigned to you is important necessarily. I mean, maybe you don't care, and that's fine. You don't have to care. But the point is, it takes time to do stuff well. You kind of have to go back and look at it a couple times. Some of those hours are planning hours, right? You're going, okay, so I have to do this. I need to find a source. Some of those hours are formatting hours. You go, okay, so maybe that's like 20 minutes or half an hour, depends on the person. And some of that time is, literally writing, or it's meeting with your instructor, and that's the real reason why we can't do these drafts in this semester. because when I do this, it requires a lot of face time between me and my students to do this assignment well, a lot. And I'm very happy with what gets produced in this class, but it just takes so much face time, so much face time. You know, that's my fall is usually packed end to end talking to students because it's a different way of thinking and it takes a while to really get used to it. So we're doing it this way. And actually, there's some upsides to doing it this way too, right? There are some things about this quiz model that we're doing, which is not so the quizzes on the skills are what we're doing in lieu instead of the written assignment and the assessments that go with them, of course. But there are things about this model I really like that I may actually bring back into a typical live class. Like you guys did learn to APA formatting really fast. I was excited, and that's usually a struggle for students. And so there are things about this model I think have been superior, actually. I think some things got reordered. It's been really good in some ways. But like I said, you know, the experience of doing the writing, and I think that's one of the reasons some of us don't feel completely solid ground in what we're doing is that it's different when you're doing it and getting feedback as opposed to you're writing about writing for me at this moment. And that makes it's a different kind of skill. So, you know, so I think that's part of the reason we kind of just don't necessarily feel on steady ground. Okay, so to circle back, yeah, so what I'm trying to teach you is a little bit more about the how, so that when you go to do the what, you're not learning both at the same time. And as a result, it's this, a lot of the sources about writing of this nature do treat them as the same because you're often doing it at the same time. But I'm telling you, they're enough of a different skill. I think it's worth doing this to the point where I don't necessarily need you to be as well informed about the exact constructs themselves in order to do this stuff so much as to understand how it works. Which a lot of times I'm like, okay, talk to me about this outline in terms of constructs. Because I just want you to talk about the relationship. How do you weave these together? And when I say relationship, I'm not telling you to spell out the findings. I want you to be like, okay, and then here they're showing how the constructs work together, and here showing how the constructs are in conflict or whatever. Okay, so as to the answer of resources that may or may not be helpful in this process, you know, we're past the hump. We've got one more section, scientific writing, which is sort of like a putting it all together kind of section, which is skills 9. And we've got the assessment on that, and then it will reappear in a small portion on the final. But the final is more like the content assessments, but it'll be a little bit in there, a little bit. Um, so, but being that we're at this point, you know, you guys in my Skills 6 supplemental video, it also contributes to this. But here's some sources that I picked out. They've been sitting here while you've listened to me talk. I'm sorry. But Kamler and Thompson and this chapter from writing from I think the book is called Writing a Successful Thesis or Dissertation. Notice that both of these talk about doctoral students because no one teaches these skills to undergrads. And you're like, well, maybe I don't need it. I disagree. But they don't teach it, right? Usually undergrads skirt around this for as long as humanly possible until suddenly they're in graduate school, masters, whatever it is. At some point, they have to write something for real and they're unprepared. And that's part of it too, is if you don't know how to tackle the problem, you spend all your time on the how and can't focus on the what, right? And this is also, you know, you know, famously undergraduate thesis plural, get kind of stonewalled, kind of, because they get stuck because they don't know how to tackle it. And this is also trying to help with that. So that being said, these are resources I pulled that talk a little bit about how to write or frame this. I think the most useful is probably this writing the introduction chapter from Writing a Successful Thesis or Dissertation. The book itself, if you go onto academia.edu, you can pull the entire book. However, I think what the chapter that's most useful for you guys is this one. There's a section on the lit review that comes after this, which honestly, I'm not saying is useless, but it kind of gets into the weeds about finding sources and evaluating, you know, evaluating sources, you know, like, is this a good article? Do I trust this person? You know, how do I go back through and look at their methods, which are good skills, but it's a little bit beyond what we're doing in this moment. But this chapter, for its part, it's, I think that was, anyway, So it talks a little bit about layout, right? And notice some of these things are things that we've talked about, right? Um, so for example, we talk definition of terms. So knowing terminology in this course is very important. And this particular chapter of this book also brings that up. Theoretical framework. Hey, we just talked about frameworks and theories in Skills 8. Or I guess we're talking about it right now. I already recorded it, so I'm done with it mentally, but for you guys, you were doing it at the same time. Oh, no, we did. No, it's skill 7. What am I saying? Falsifiability is 8. Anyway, skill 7, we're talking about frameworks because, you really should be upfront about what you're assuming. Not everyone you're going to write for will agree with you. Here's the research questions and or hypotheses. And then, so limitations, perhaps delimitations is more like setting the bounds. Assumptions, which of course jumps back a little bit to framework, and then organization. So in addition, you guys would additionally have sort of the discussion of the constructs together and so on and so forth. But this talks you through, here's some samples, right, of what these pieces of writing look like, right? And so I would say that what they say here doesn't necessarily link precisely with the questions I've asked you for, but it really does kind of give you a sense of what are look at this section. This section's talking about it's kind of oh, this is their definition, right? So model, theory, organizational theory, anyway, so there's definitions and such. And here's framework. It kind of lays out the bigger questions, right? So I think somewhere in here, for example, some models, some people when they deal with models and frameworks, model is kind of a version of framework. A lot of times they do these sort of maps, right? So this is so if someone says model in lieu of framework, they're kind of talking about this. So it's kind of like a framework, except for they like to visualize sort of. And right now I don't recall the most popular words for this, but it's something like a mind map, that kind of thing. Strategic planning model, right? Research questions. So this kind of will talk about the problem in sort of a different way, right? So here they're talking about null research, null hypotheses and questions and some more samples, right? So, I mean, if you feel like more information, more examples are useful to you, this chapter I think is good for that stuff because it's kind of talking about the underlying nuts and bolts. The piece with if you look on academia.edu for this particular book, which is writing a successful thesis or dissertation, which means if you Google it, if you go like download copy writing successful thesis or dissertation, you'll find it. The link should show up. If you don't find it, let me know. So if you want to continue reading with the lit review, except the next chapter, chapter 7, is on that. The chapters that got skipped 1 through 5 are on like study design, which that's 490. Anyway, this other one that I'm giving you is kind of about style in a way, but I think if you read it closely, you learn some stuff about how this writing sounds like, right? So this kind of gets into the other half of it, right? The organization of the argument and stuff. But in some degree, it's also talking about usage of sources, which we haven't gotten deeply into, but you can kind of see. So this is chapter 3 of this book, Persuading an Octopus into a Glass, Working with Literature. This is a very cheeky way to talk about this. So they talk about what are the tasks of the literature review, but what I think this is really nice for is they go through kind of problems when you're writing. So for example, this person, Vera, is a doctoral researcher writing about talk about stuff being crowded by literature, which is to say they just cite. Or for example, this person, they talk about the invisible scholar, also known as he said, she said, where they say so and so says, and then so and so says, and so the actual person writing's voice is lost, for example, etc. So that's what I think this is nice. So metaphors to live by. I think this one's nice because it kind of talks about in some sense, the voice piece, right? The sort of keeping track of, I guess the relationship between using evidence and actually writing is kind of what I would say is encapsulated in this particular one. Okay, so that's what I have for you at this point. So generally, I'm just checking in because it's been a fun semester and challenging in different ways, but also because I wanted to present these 2 sources to you. If you want to read more, this is completely optional reading. It's just for those of you who were wanting more stuff to look at. These are 2 things that I think are fairly appropriate for what you guys are doing. But reach out to me if questions on this, questions or related things, or just generally checking in. Let me know.